Yes, this topic is quite elusive in certain ways, and indeed, it's a very important topic because this sometimes called ghost in the machine. If you consider the human being as a biological mechanism, that's the ghost of the machine. That's that part that seems to escape measurement, and who, along history, we can find a lot of references of controversies on nature of soul. Lots of controversies, lots of spiritual debates, and I will refer a little bit to it, not just because it's interesting, but also to see why sometimes it might look difficult. But on the other hand, from my experience, I started it as a scientist in this life, and finding explanations and finding very good, solid um, theories and experiments. And I have to say, soul was one of the topics I've tried to approach from both science, religion, and I did have quite many surprises on many sides. First of all, the soul was viewed a long time as a separate structure of the human being. It's viewed as something that, generally speaking, if we look throughout different theories and statements and what people were confessing after clinical death experiences or near-death experiences, spiritual experiences, out of body experiences. So most of the time is considered to be a structure that is independent, at least independent to this machinery that we are constantly identified with, which is the physical body, the one that is aware of this physical reality through the five senses. On the other hand, one of the big controversies, of course, regarding this structure is the possibility to transcend death, to exist beyond death. And of course, I have to say, for years, of course, as a teenager, I was fascinated by all the stories about time travel, and I grew up in almost a library of all kinds of books, on some of them serious science, some of them science fiction on time travel. But I can tell you, as a quantum physicist, that the problem of death is hilariously viewed today by most of us. To see that, to consider that life is just between these two events, random events, birth and death. It's actually not even making sense, the definition, because time-space is not confined to that kind of very little approximation. So even from this perspective, we can say that the soul survives death because the soul doesn't interact with that which is mortal in the way that other elements in the physical body interact, and they decay after the so-called death. Anyway, there were a lot of experiments done. I can tell you, in the ancient time, they were attempts to catch the soul of human beings. And as far as, for instance, in India, there was a king in Bihar, King Payasi, who was doing experiments with people in the death row. He was trying to catch their soul. He was trying to see if the soul exists, and he wrote an entire compendium of experiments that they were boiling the people. They were doing all kinds of sinister methods in an attempt to see if it's something coming out when they die. And of course, he's the first one who was trying to weigh. Probably you heard about that. It was much later on in Europe. Recreated the experiment, putting people on a scale or something, a weighing instrument that is very sensitive, and when the person dies, to see if it's there is a difference. And interestingly, they notice some difference. Some people say it's a sudden release of the water molecules and some vapors that is always this many grams that was determined like that. Some are saying is ectoplasmatic structure. It doesn't matter. Fact is, since ancient time, people were fascinated by this and they tried to underline it. Just to so that you know the finish of the story, King Payasi died being convinced there is no soul. All his experiments failed to prove the existence of, in an objective way, the existence of the soul. Now, in order to understand this issue, think about the following situation. If you have a radio set, and imagine the following situation. You have the radio set off, you put it on an extraordinary fine, extraordinary accurate scale, and you wait, and when it's dead, it has a certain weight. And if you turn it on and it starts to have a lot of music, a lot of life in it, you can imagine that it weighs exactly the same amount. I hope we agree with that. It's a mental experiment, but you can do it home. Anyway, it's quite difficult to find some, of course, I know there are some conditions depending on what's the frequency you play on the loudspeakers. If you put the loudspeakers in a certain position, they can generate an anti-gravitational effect if they play a certain frequency, and therefore you might trick the scale. But I'm talking about just normal function of radio. But what I'm saying is this, that in exactly the same way, our interaction function inside of this machinery, we are just exactly like the animation program in a radio set. We are, which doesn't have a direct measurable consistency, yet we can hear its effects. We can, if it is, for instance, a computer or a TV set, we can see it. And yet when it's off, it's gone. Everything in it, it's gone, and as if it was never there. So I'm saying this because this is one of the paradoxical situations regarding the soul. We are trying to see it in an objective way as if it is a secretion of matter, as if it is attached to matter, as if the radio set would be responsible for the music that plays inside. And it is, to the extent it's receiving by resonance the radio program, and it is not, because it doesn't have absolutely anything to do with the program itself, the program that is playing. So in this way, the this problem of the soul was somehow approached from this materialistic perspective in a, I would say, rather wrong direction. Now, of course, I will give you another example of another phenomena that happens, a phenomena that is very much related to how we are as a consciousness. It is it was used in ancient time. Imagine the following thing. You look at a river that is flowing constantly. Let's say a river more in the mountains, because when it's in flat fields, sometimes the river is so flat you almost can't see it's flowing. But let's say it's a little bit higher in the mountains, and as you know, the river makes a lot of waves at its surface. But if you fix your gaze to a part of the surface of the river, you will catch one wave. And that wave, even though it's moving, the water is moving there, yet the bump on the surface of the water there, it's almost constant. It's probably generated by the rocks on the bottom of the river, by the dynamics of the fluid on all those rocks. Fact is, this constant flow of water and the conditions of flowing around are generating what we call stationary waves. And there are some bumps on the river there which might be there for thousands of years. If those rocks are in the same position for, let's say, 2,000 years, people 2,000 years ago, they went to wash their face in the river and they saw that bump on the water, even though obviously it's not the same molecules. So much water was flowing on that river all this time, and yet the shape is constantly there. Now, the shape there is formed by the conditions, the flow, the intensity of the flow of the water. And in a certain way, this existence that we have is the result of such flow of energy through all kinds of mediums, and bouncing into different mediums, it creates what we usually call our consciousness. What we are just a shape of a wave that is maintained constant for a while. After a while, the setting is disturbed. Well, the setting is disturbed strong enough, that is called death. And then the river moves on and the wave disappears. But the water that was shaping that wave is actually constantly flowing. Now, if you want to take a glass box and you want to isolate one of these waves on the surface of the river, and you just put it on top of it, you can imagine what happens inside the box. The wave is not existing anymore. It will be flat water. Even though if you take the box out, the water will flow again as this wave. So it's only when it's connected to the rest, it creates that specific shape. And if you give that specific shape a name, here you have it. You give an identity even. You say that wave which lives there, different than the other wave which lives 2 meters away from it, a little bit higher up the river, a little bit down the river, and so on. They can have history, they can have interaction, they can have names, and so on. And that's, but when you try to catch them, they don't exist. They vanish because they only make sense in the river itself. It's another analogy that was used thousands of years ago to describe the human condition. And also it would have saved King Payasi and others great deal if they would have learned about such analogies. They would have learned that practically what they were trying to isolate. They were trying to know the soul isolated from the river. There is no such thing. It makes sense only within the river, only within the flow. So in this way, we can understand that the conscious principle and all its laws and principles, they are everywhere. They apply everywhere. And there is a certain dynamics that is pushing everything forward, including what we call the space, including what we call the time. Now we started to realize that space even have a direction, and it's expanding with a certain acceleration. Time has a very interesting structure we thought is completely independent. Now we correct that error, and the results are quite interesting. But the soul, that part of us which is giving us the possibility to be self-aware, that is part of this flow. That is part of what keeps things flowing. And this is the reason why when I'm speaking, the flow that goes through this body is actually not going only through this body, it's going through the whole surrounding. It's coming from the surrounding, bouncing into every molecule in this body, creates effects that are generating even strings of thoughts, ideas that I want to communicate, even then going to the subroutines and tickling the vocal cords and all this. They're not tickling, they're vibrating, but anyway. And in the end, creating this effect of being alive and communicating with each other. But in reality, all this is a result, you can say, of this flow that is going through constantly. That's the reason why the more we open up, and I wouldn't go yet into what means open up, but simply the more we open up, the more we feel the soul, we feel the wave, so to speak. And the less we open up, the more we are convinced we are just an isolated box from the flow, the more we feel flat, the more we feel like there is just a computer running some programs, and there is nothing alive inside. And actually, very often today, people feel less and less alive and with a soul. Not that they don't have a soul, but they are very much filtering the river around. And the filters are quite clogged with all kind of stuff accumulated. And because of that, simply the water doesn't create a wave with personality, with strength, with aspirations, but is almost completely flattened. Now, in the ancient time, there was a structure that was described about the human being, which is very much like a radio set. A radio set that is making possible to capture from the surrounding certain energy and to bring it into lower and lower frequencies, lower and lower nature, until even physical existence. And in this way, from the very abstract intention for a gesture to moving clusters of molecules in the shape of a hand, all that is aligned with energetics that are extremely fine-tuned. The fact that we don't perceive them is just because we just ignore them. We look from the wrong perspective. I can tell you from experience. When I heard first time about these theories, I said, wow, that's fascinating, but there's no evidence about it. Of course, having such education, I grew up in a family of scientists. I couldn't ignore the perfect logic of this structure of the human being, energetics of the human being. It's perfectly operational. It makes sense. It makes perfect engineering sense. So I started to wonder, what if could be right? Maybe we ignored this. Yeah, through experimentation and study, I could see that not only it makes sense, but it makes the only sense I have seen so far, explaining all the phenomena, including what is called the soul. So I will tell you briefly this story of the energetics of the human being. Just, of course, this is a very vast lesson, very vast presentation, but just in a short way to see, you will see that it has a logic in it. So the ancients describe the human being as starting from a spark of self-awareness. They say that we are like a spark in total darkness, a spark of bright light. And that spark of bright light is completely free. It's not attached to any conceptualization, is not yet anything but just self-aware. Now, of course, it's very interesting. Those of you who studied a little bit of psychology, mathematics, physics, you know that we always had a problem, and we still have this major problem with the reference point. We can explain a lot about the world and about the human being, but we cannot explain one thing: the origin. Even the astrophysics has this cartoon idea with the Big Bang, which is practically a hyper-religious belief that out of nothing, suddenly, out of a Big Bang, which is nothing else but exactly what all the religions are saying, call it creation, whatever, boom, everything came to existence. And including time, space, because time didn't exist before that. That's a funny thing. And so that's why I'm saying it's a hyper-religious theory, which has absolutely nothing to support it, behind it. However, it is an attempt to solve one problem: the origin. How did self-awareness started? When we are born, how do we know we are? You know, self-awareness started to fascinate human being from inception. So now, it makes sense what the ancients were saying. It all starts with a spark of self-awareness. It's what we are first and foremost. That's the fundamental reality. This is who we are. It's an I. It's an I that then will start to accumulate all kinds of energetics around. And first is accumulating the most refined energies in the universe, so refined that they escape far from anything that we have the possibility to conceive today in the material world. But anyway, we know they exist because they are the ones which are the origin of all principles, all laws of the universe, all the patterns that exist in the universe. They are these which support, and we admit that today, even though we couldn't detect them yet, but we know somebody keeps in place the laws. Otherwise, there would be no laws and principles in the universe. So there must be some force fields. It must be something that maintains them all. These energies, the ancients actually spoke very openly about them. And they not only spoke about them, they even described 36 categories of these energies. Fascinating also, because this is the number of primordial forces that we have calculated today that must have existed in the beginning, not 5, but 36, exactly as the ancients say that they were originally. So how did the ancients knew? That's a totally different story. But so they say that first, this I starts to rely on different categories. So different archetypical forms. And then is surrounding furthermore on another layer, which is containing ideas. So there is another layer of the energetics that is a little more gross, if we can say gross at that level, that is containing all the fundamental ideas. Yeah. So with other words, you are I, and I happy, I ecstatic, I luminous, all the fundamental essential qualities. And then you have all kind of fundamental ideas, up, down, further, backward, expansion, contraction, fundamental operations. And that will constitute a being that is starting to understand the first notion of shape, but not the notion of shape as we understand it in the sense of this shape at this time, but shape as a general aspect. So with other words, that is how we live. And when you have a moment when you're gone in a very, very profound process of thinking, and you're gone beyond shape, beyond the immediate reality, sometimes you experience a glimpse into this existence of yours, completely unbound to normal space-time. And this is, let's say, the first two layers of the human being, ready to step into space-time. Then space-time appears. The space-time continuum is what now in avant-garde science we call the locality. The existence of our being before this is the non-local existence. It's an existence that is everywhere and every time. And suddenly we have a time and a space. We have an unfolding of events. We have a sequence. We have an order. And this is where we start to attach the I, together with all its understanding, but again, a very, very abstract understanding. You start to attach it to localize it to a certain form of I am. And when you say I am, you already imply I am not everything else. And that is where we start to need a shape, a very well-defined shape that exists in a very clearly defined time. You can't exist in two times simultaneously. There is a very clear exclusion principle that is maintained in place from above, even though it's just a convention, because nobody is telling us we cannot, but we are sure that if we are here in this room, we can't be anywhere else. So in this way, we have a mind. The mind is the sum of all our thoughts that are associated to a certain history, to a certain time and space, the thoughts that we can generate as an individual. Once we have a mind, we already have an onboard computer, and that onboard computer needs a hardware. And that hardware is generating all the basic energetics that are supporting this physical body that we use in the everyday life for 7-8 decades in average. And after that, what happens is that the physical body runs out of juice. The energetics that supports it are dissolving. It takes 40-50 days until it's gone, the energetics of the body. That's the reason why very often in graveyards, in a freshly dug grave, people can see in the night, especially when atmospheric conditions are in a special way, they can see a bluish electrostatic radiance above the graves which are freshly dug. You can try, it's quite easy, especially after rain. You can see this phenomena after when the atmosphere is quite electrically charged. It lasts up to 40-something, 50 days, and is gone. So practically that is the energetics of it. And the mind is of the individual that existed in that body is also dismembering into its component parts everything related to the personality of that person. Most of it is dissolved, but all the conclusions, life lessons, everything that you have understood that is related deeper to you than just the time-space lessons, everything remains in the two energetic layers that are formed first, and they never disappear. They are somehow the frame that all spiritual traditions call the soul. So that's that's an ancient view. Today there are lots of attempts to, of course, put this into perspective, experiments trying to see these things in a way or another. But I gave you the synthetic version of the 5 energetic layers, 3 of which are the localized ones, which are disappearing after this physical body is gone, and 2 of which, together with the spark of I-ness, they are remaining always, and then after a while get attached to another opportunity, take another incoming body, and well, continue the adventure with a lot of other experiences. So, as you can see in this whole story, part of what we are now, part of what we experience now, is strictly related to these conditions. They will die together with these walls, together with this body. They are just staying here. And part of it, they are always there. They are going with us constantly. We are always witnessing life through that perspective as well. But there is a superimposition process. We add layer after layer, and therefore we get used with the superficial layer that appear in front of us. Of course, what you see today, for instance, is an attempt to rewrite the radio set. And imagine that what happens if you're having a radio set in which you constantly hear a certain program, because that's the program that you connect with all the time. And imagine that at some point, somebody is modifying some of the electronic components there. You might lose contact with that radio set or radio program forever. And this is what we are seeing today. Unfortunately, not understanding what they are doing through nanotechnology and genetic engineering, that is what is happening. That's the reason why I know that from inside, from experiments that were done in Soviet Union in the 60s and 70s, that was quite a dramatic failure. The Soviets were very adamant to create super soldiers and superhuman beings, and also they were not so much bound to morality, and they managed to create genetic mutations in the human beings, but they lost their souls. They were like a zombie. They knew how to eat, they were speaking, but it was nobody home. They could execute orders, but they were completely blank. And of course, there was more implications to that, because they couldn't rely on them to take decisions. They were practically like a vegetable. But a very resilient vegetable, including they managed to operate some mutations to make people resist nuclear radiation and other quite severe environment, with the price of what you can call the soul. And this is the reason why it was stopped. Well, we don't know if it stopped. At least we were told that it stopped at the time. So these moments of self-awareness are the moments which allow, to give you an example, allow us the capacity to re-actualize our system of values. We see today a very big problem with that. We cannot re-actualize ourselves and our system of values, but very seldom, because our contact with this soul, with this higher being, is extremely little. And because of that, we are exactly like a computer that can run any program you want. And you can see today, same person who can say a set of values about one thing and totally different set of values about something else, even though it's the same person. And you might think, but you can't say that because you just said, this is your belief and this is your set of values. How can you say about, for instance, yourself, I'm allowed to do that because I'm doing this in the name of humanity and so on. And when you see exactly the same thing, somebody else doing it, you condemn it with a completely different set of values, and you find a completely different justification. This level of hypocrisy that we see today at this social level, unprecedented. Many people blame the social media, but it's not the social media. Social media is just a reflection. The result is the lack of access to the soul. The more a person have access to the soul, which means to the energetic layers beyond the mind, the more that person have an inner compass that will be infallible. And of course, that it makes that person not only an extraordinarily reliable citizen, reliable in the most profound sense, but is also making that person extremely coherent in taking decisions in its own life and so on. Statistically speaking, most of the people today don't suffer of not knowing what to do. Statistically speaking, studies are showing most of the people suffer of knowing what to do. They act as if they don't know what to do. Most of the people act contrary to what they declare themselves. Look, I think this should be like that. Good. Why did you act in that situation, which was a life-changing situation? Why did you act like that? It's contrary to what you said. And of course, this is a long story. There was a lot of attempts to explain why are we so controversial? Why are we so conflictual? What happens? And of course, they blame desires, the fact that we're exposed to different inner forces and so on. But I can tell you, putting together all this, it's just a matter of the soul. A person with a soul, which means a person with a contact with the soul, a person whose soul is more forward than being in the background life there, is a person who is having this kind of coherency, is a person who, once understanding something, starts to act accordingly. A person with no soul, they will say, yeah, it's amazing what you say now, but you are acting no different. Oh, sorry. That's a person without soul. Now you can see why it's important, because I'm teaching and I'm practicing for 30 years. I'm teaching for 25 years. Spirituality. I taught in university artificial intelligence and other things. And I can tell you one thing, the biggest problem of anyone who attempts learning and transforming something to themselves is the fact that they can't keep it up. This is the number one problem of humanity today. If humanity will live up to its principles, we'll be a species like we see in these movies, Avatar, or all these ideal beings, because we are ideal beings. We are endowed with extraordinary capacities, but we live a life at the minimum of our biology. We are using 4% of our brain, and you know why? Because less than 4%, we will die. Biological life with this physiology will not be possible. But we went down. Humanity didn't evolve to 4%. Humanity descaled the use of the brain. People who built the pyramids, they were not using 4%. If they were using 4% of their brain capacity, they will still build the first one. It took humanity 200 years to to build, not 200 years, almost, to build Gaudi's Sagrada Familia, who was a super genius, by the way, and we're still struggling to finish that one. Yeah, that was an achievement, and we are dumber and dumber, which means it's slower and slower constantly. What I'm saying, we're not living up to our potential. On the contrary, we're lowering our potential. And we reach to the bottom. As I said, studies are showing under 3.5, 4%. Not possible with all this configuration. So either a new mutation will appear and human beings a little more simplified will appear with not so many organs and so on, but more efficient, running faster, eating more, sex more, who knows what. But either that, and they will use only 1% of that capacity, or we stopped and reversed the process. The point is that today we are kind of like zombies, because the problem is we're not jumping over the physiology. We're not jumping at all. And we are given enormous brain capacity, we're given enormous heart capacity, we're given intuition. You know, we're given instruments that allows us to stay with our field of awareness above space-time continuum. We can be everywhere. We are literally trying desperately for 80 years in average to ignore our capacities. This is a constant struggle of ignoring. And yes, the fact that 7.5 billion people are successful doesn't mean successful in ignoring their potential, doesn't make it right. And this is the reason why this presence of the soul, in fact, doesn't mean that one have a soul and that another one doesn't have it. It means that the one who has a soul is a person whose awareness is at that level, is a person who lives at the level of the soul. Other one lives at the level of the belly. And then for living at that level, as I said, you don't need much of intelligence. You don't need much of almost anything. It's just the machine doing its job on autopilot. And of course, this is having, of course, heavy consequences. Behavioral control. Today, we are attempting to create a new society. Some poor lunatics are talking today more and more about the Great Reset. In my opinion, one of the biggest jokes I heard in the last 3 decades. But human stupidity never ceased to amaze you. Some people who were probably too young in the time of Hitler, the inventor of Davos, this economic forum, he's even from that area. He was probably too young to join Hitler Jugend, and now he invented a full-scale Nazi. He published 3 or 4 books about it, and many people in the world are praising this nightmare, which, among other things, is talking about behavioral control. Behavioral control, it's an imbecility. You don't need behavioral control. As long as people are aware of their soul, you don't need to have behavioral control, because everyone is interconnecting naturally. Behavioral control is needed the less awareness you have. Like, for instance, with animals. With animals, you want to obtain something, you start to program their behavior. And they're talking about this openly now with implant, transhumanism, implant of all kind of nanotechnology that will reprogram some, well, I don't think they even understand what they're talking about. But what I'm talking here about is the fact that all these things are reactions to the fact that indeed we go astray from ourselves, but the solution is to come back to ourselves, not to make things worse. Try to solve the problem by aggravating it, as it is done today. So if we look from another perspective, of course, everything that is encouraging this disconnection from our soul, from these higher energetic layers, is making every individual very easy programmable. A person who doesn't have contact with the soul cannot protect themselves against certain methods of programming, and is proven. I know everybody thinks, no, they cannot hypnotize me. I cannot be this, I cannot be that. Yeah, everybody says that until they fall victim to it. And that's the art of it, that you don't figure it out. And then you're convinced, no, this is what I decided. This is my concept. I was the one looking for this. I was the one thinking like that, and so on. Even though, surprisingly, it was exactly within the estimated behavior. So that's the reason why it is very much also encouraged today. Unfortunately, because it seems that it gives us a very easy go, because in this way, apparently we solve some of the acute problems of humanity, but we don't solve them. On the contrary, we create more and more zombified beings that have a soul sitting there locked, and then they sit outside trapped into a kind of nightmarish existence with zero power to influence it. From this perspective, the methods that are helping one to become self-aware and therefore to awaken the soul are practically methods that are giving you freedom, giving you the capacity to be yourself without absolutely any possibility for anyone or anything outside to influence you in any way, because it can't be. The soul is not exactly touching this world or can be touched by this world. This is the, let's say, a brief introduction about the soul that I was preparing for you today.